In January 1941, Berlin laughed. Inside the marble corridors of the Reich Chancellery, the air was thick with cigar smoke and certainty. Hitler had just finished another of his late-night monologues, pacing before a map of Europe like a theater actor before an audience that dared not breathe. He pointed west, toward the Atlantic, and said, "Americans can build cars, not tanks." The room erupted in polite laughter, the sound of arrogance disguised as confidence. One general remarked that the United States was a nation of mechanics and advertisements. Another joked that their army still rode on horses. The Führer smiled thinly. He believed it. Outside, Berlin slept under blackout curtains, but far across the ocean, another kind of light burned, fluorescent and steady, the color of industry. In Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt was addressing the nation. His voice, calm but sharpened with resolve, filled American living rooms. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he said. "We must build to defend not only ourselves, but the world." Factories that had once made comfort now prepared for war. In Detroit, the heart of the American automobile dream, workers gathered around radios on their lunch breaks. Men with oil-stained hands and sleepless eyes listened, chewing in silence. A machinist named Jack Reynolds stubbed out his cigarette and muttered, "We've built machines for life. Guess we can build them for victory too." At that moment, the United States had only 331 operational tanks. Germany had over 3,000. The balance seemed absurd, impossible. Yet, on those same assembly lines that once turned out Chevrolets and Fords, engineers were already sketching blueprints on the backs of old invoices. Every sound, the hiss of welding, the hammer on steel, was a quiet promise. In Berlin, propaganda declared that America lacked the discipline, the will, the blood instinct of war. They showed newsreels of Americans dancing to jazz, of movie stars and baseball games. "They will drown in comfort," said Goebbels. "Their factories make toys, not weapons." But something in those factories had already changed. By spring, the orders from Washington multiplied. The War Department demanded engines by the thousands, tracks by the miles, and armor plate thicker than anything Detroit had ever forged. The industrial heart of America began to throb faster. In a letter to his wife, one Ford plant engineer wrote, "Every machine that rolls out feels heavier, like it already knows where it's going." At first, the workers joked about it, the absurdity of civilians building tools for a war they hadn't yet entered. But after Pearl Harbor, the laughter stopped. What had been a challenge became an obligation. America had been insulted, and insult had always been the most dangerous fuel. By late 1941, Ford's River Rouge plant ran 24 hours a day. Entire neighborhoods lived to its rhythm. Whistles at dawn, steam at dusk, sparks flaring into the night sky. From above, Detroit glowed red, a man-made sunrise that never faded. Historians would later call it the awakening. But to the people inside it, it was simpler. It was work, relentless, exacting, loud. Somewhere between the noise and exhaustion, the arrogance in Berlin began to age. Reports from intelligence hinted that American industry was shifting at a speed no one thought possible. Hitler dismissed them all. "They are a nation of shoppers," he said. "They cannot make war." But on the floor of an assembly hall in Michigan, a welder named Eleanor Mason was tightening a steel bolt into a tank engine. She had never seen combat, but her brother was fighting in North Africa. On the back of a factory photo, she scribbled, "You fight there. I'll fight here." No one knew it yet, but the sound of her wrench turning echoed far beyond Detroit, across the Atlantic, across the silence between continents. By the end of 1941, Germany's confidence had become a kind of blindness. They still mocked America as a land of soft hands and shiny cars. But in the factories of that land, the hands were already bleeding. The Reich laughed in January. By December, no one was laughing anymore. Because in the distance, beneath the noise of speeches and marching boots, a deeper sound had begun, the rumble of an engine the world had never heard before. The sound of an arsenal waking up. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Detroit, February 1942. The snow outside was black with soot. Every morning, the air vibrated before sunrise, the whistle of Ford's River Rouge plant calling tens of thousands of men and women to work. The city that once sold dreams on wheels now built machines for war. A banner hung over the entrance. The arsenal of democracy works here. It wasn't propaganda. It was a schedule. Inside, the factory floor looked nothing like the past. The familiar smell of rubber and paint was replaced by hot steel and welding smoke. Rows of engines waited like dormant beasts. Sparks rained from the rafters as workers transformed car frames into tank hulls. The new design was called the M4 Sherman, a machine meant not to be perfect, but unstoppable. William Newman, a quiet engineer who used to design civilian motors, stood over the first prototype. He had received a simple but impossible order from Washington: build a tank that can be made faster than it can be destroyed. He wrote in his notebook that night, "We're not building a machine. We're building time itself." They had almost nothing at first. No spare steel, no specialized tools, no blueprint that actually worked. The first Shermans rattled like tractors and leaked oil from every seam. But they moved. That was enough. A test driver named Harold Red Nolan climbed into the first finished model on a frozen February morning. When he turned the ignition, the floor trembled. The engine's roar filled the hangar, and everyone stopped working for a moment. "She's ugly," Red shouted over the noise, "but she's mean." No one laughed. They were too tired to laugh, and too proud to stop. In another corner of the plant, women stood shoulder to shoulder at welding stations. They wore heavy gloves and goggles, faces lit by orange sparks. One of them, Eleanor Mason, had never held a tool before the war. Her brother was fighting in Tunisia. Her husband had died in Pearl Harbor. She rode home every week. "The work is hard, but it feels right. Each bolt I turn might bring someone home alive." The Shermans rolled off the line by the dozen, then by the hundred. At first, Detroit sent 2 tanks a day. By summer, 1 every hour. When General Motors joined in, the numbers multiplied again. Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, cities turned into forges. America wasn't just producing tanks. It was creating an industrial rhythm no army could silence. Reporters who toured the plants described the noise as a heartbeat made of iron. The machines didn't stop, not for Sundays, not for holidays. Even at midnight, the windows pulsed with red light, and the night smelled like oil and purpose. Workers began measuring their days not in shifts, but in tanks. For tanks before lunch, they'd say, 6 before dark. The U.S. Army sent inspectors to oversee production. One of them, Major Raymond Scott, wrote in his report, "The problem is not getting tanks. The problem is finding enough ground to park them." At the same time, on the other side of the ocean, a German intelligence officer in Paris received his own report. It estimated that the United States had produced 10,000 armored vehicles in the previous 12 months. He read it twice, frowned, and wrote across the margin, "Unverhältnismäßig, impossible." But the numbers were real. Detroit was alive in a way Berlin couldn't imagine. Still, for those inside the plants, the work was brutal. Heat, exhaustion, accidents. Men lost fingers. Women fainted from fumes. One worker said, "We weren't fighting Hitler. We were fighting the clock." And yet, the clock was losing. By December 1942, the first Shermans were crossing the Atlantic. They arrived in dusty North African ports, painted green and smelling of new metal. American soldiers ran their hands along the armor and smiled. "Detroit's got our backs," someone said. On Christmas Eve, Ford's factory foreman read out the final number for the year, 8,000 tanks. The floor went silent. Then someone started clapping. Within seconds, the entire building joined in, thousands of tired hands striking together, echoing like artillery. That winter, Roosevelt sent a letter to Ford's executives. It read simply, "You have turned the impossible into assembly." But for William Newman, the man who had drawn the first sketches of the Sherman, the work was far from over. He stood by the last tank of the year and ran his hand across its welded seams. It wasn't smooth, not elegant, but it was alive, forged by the hands of people who refused to accept laughter as prophecy. He looked at his reflection in the steel and whispered, "They laughed at us." Then the tank's engine started, drowning out his words with a deep, rolling thunder that shook the ground. And somewhere, far across the Atlantic, that same sound reached the ears of the men who had once believed America couldn't fight. For the first time, Berlin began to listen. And the echo carried one clear message: the arsenal was awake. Berlin, January 1943. The city was gray with cold and silence. In the War Ministry's map room, the air smelled of dust and cigarette ash. Officers shuffled papers, but no one spoke. On the table lay a report from the Luftwaffe's intelligence division, stamped Geheim. American tank production, the heading read, estimated at 25,000 units. For a long moment, no one moved. Then an adjutant coughed, breaking the tension. 25,000, a general repeated, his voice trembling between disbelief and anger. That's absurd. But the numbers were real. The Americans were building tanks the way they built refrigerators, fast, cheap, and endless. Hitler read the report and laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that didn't reach his eyes. They drown themselves in quantity, he said. Steel without soul. Machines without men. He tossed the paper aside. Let them come. In that same month, across the sea, the M4 Sherman made its debut in North Africa. Under the burning sun of Tunisia, columns of dust stretched for miles. The tanks weren't elegant. They clanked, rattled, and sometimes caught fire under enemy shells. But when one was destroyed, another arrived the next morning. And another after that. A British officer watching from a ridge wrote in his diary, "We saw them burn. And then we saw them again. Same model, same name, different men inside." The Germans called them Tommy Cookers, easy kills. But soon, even the Afrika Corps began to notice something strange. The Shermans never stopped coming. It didn't matter how many were destroyed. The convoys from the ports kept delivering them like a tide that refused to turn back. In Berlin, intelligence officers tried to make sense of it. A young statistician, Hans Schulz, stood in front of a wall covered with maps and charts. He had spent weeks comparing photos from aerial reconnaissance. "They build them like toasters," he said softly, almost to himself. His superior stared at him. "What did you say?" Schulz looked up. "It's the same principle, sir. Interchangeable parts, continuous production, no delays. They lose one, they make 10. That night, Schulz wrote in his private notes, "We are fighting not an army, but a machine. Every factory is a soldier." Meanwhile, in Detroit, the rhythm of industry became a kind of music. Conveyor belts hummed like endless strings, and every clang of steel was a heartbeat. A single factory could finish a Sherman every 45 minutes. The men and women working those lines didn't see themselves as heroes. They just punched in, wiped sweat from their eyes, and kept building. Eleanor Mason, the welder whose brother still fought in Tunisia, received his letter in March. "Your tanks came today. They look rough, but they move like hell. Keep sending them." She folded the letter and taped it above her workstation. In the desert, movement was everything. The Shermans could travel 50 miles in a day, enough to outflank Rommel's positions. They weren't stronger than German tanks, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to exist in greater numbers than the enemy could destroy. In May, after a week of heavy fighting, the Germans ran out of fuel. Rommel ordered a retreat, but the Shermans kept advancing, their tracks grinding across the sand like a slow, unstoppable tide. When reports reached Berlin, they were met with disbelief. "How can they be everywhere?" one general shouted. "It's impossible." But by summer, the impossible had a name: mass production. At a secret meeting in the Reich Chancellery, officers debated how to respond. Some proposed building heavier tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, with thicker armor and bigger guns. Others warned that such machines took too long to build. 100 German workers for every 10 Americans. Hitler slammed his fist on the table. "We will build monsters," he declared. And they did. The Tiger was terrifying, nearly indestructible, but so complex it required weeks of repairs after every battle. For every Tiger that rolled out of a German factory, America built 50 Shermans. In a captured letter from a German tanker later that year, the despair was plain. "They come like waves. We destroy 10, 20, 30, and the horizon moves again, crawling with more." The myth of German invincibility began to crack, not from strategy, but from arithmetic. At the Ford plant, William Newman read the same reports with quiet pride. The Sherman wasn't perfect, he knew its flaws better than anyone, but it did what it was meant to do. It never stopped. He told a visiting reporter, "We don't build tanks to last forever. We build them to arrive." By the end of 1943, the United States had produced more armored vehicles than all Axis powers combined. Steel had become a language, and America was speaking it fluently. Back in Berlin, Schulz filed his final analysis. It contained just one line beneath a column of figures. The enemy is not a tank. The enemy is a factory. His report never reached Hitler's desk. It didn't need to. The truth was already rolling across North Africa, over Italy, and soon, toward Europe itself. The Reich had built myths. America had built machines. And machines, unlike myths, did not run out of faith. June 6, 1944. Before dawn, the English Channel was calm, too calm. Beneath its gray surface moved an army of steel, engines sealed tight, crews silent inside. Each one carried hope, fear, and 50 tons of metal. They were called Sherman DDs, duplex drive, amphibious tanks, designed in haste and tested in secret. They were supposed to swim. Some said they never would. Sergeant Tom Grayson, a 26-year-old from Cleveland, Ohio, stood on the deck of a landing craft staring at his own machine, his Cleveland Belle. The tank was wrapped in a canvas screen that looked like a child's toy raft. The waves lapped at its base, black and cold. Grayson used to fix cars before the war. Now he was driving one into the sea. The commander shouted over the wind. 2 minutes to launch. Grayson adjusted his gloves and whispered, "If this thing floats, I'll never doubt America again." Then the ramp dropped. The water rushed in, dark and endless. The tank slid off the deck and splashed down hard. For a few seconds, it floated. Then the engine coughed, sputtered, and roared. The men cheered, until they saw the next tank vanish beneath a wave. One after another, the DDs sank. The wind picked up, tearing through the thin canvas shields. Radio chatter crackled in Grayson's ears. "Number 4's gone under. Number 7's taking water. God help us, they're going down one by one." Grayson gritted his teeth and pressed the throttle. The Sherman groaned, but held steady. He saw the faint outline of the French coast ahead. Smoke, flashes, chaos. "Come on, girl," he muttered. "Just a little farther." Minutes stretched like hours. Inside the tank, water pooled at their boots. The mechanic yelled, "She's flooding." Grayson didn't answer. He just kept steering toward the beach. When the treads finally touched sand, the crew didn't cheer. They were too stunned to believe they'd made it. The canvas shield tore away, revealing the gun. "Targets ahead," said the gunner. Grayson gave the order. The cannon fired. The first shell exploded against a German bunker, sending debris into the air. The other surviving Shermans followed, crawling out of the surf like sea monsters. By 8:30 a.m., a handful of tanks had reached Omaha Beach. They opened fire to cover the infantry pinned down by machine guns. One soldier later said, "When those tanks came out of the water, we thought we were seeing ghosts." Half the DDs were lost before they even saw land. But the few that survived turned the tide. Their guns silenced nests that had pinned men for hours. The sand was slick with blood and oil, and above it all rose the grinding, mechanical roar of the Shermans. Grayson's tank took a hit near the afternoon. The shock slammed through the hull. One crewman screamed. "We're still moving," Grayson shouted. "Keep firing." The smell of fuel and smoke filled the cabin. Through the periscope, he saw Germans running, abandoning their positions, their defenses crumbling. By dusk, the beach was littered with twisted metal, both German and Allied. The tide dragged burned wrecks back into the sea. Grayson climbed out of his tank and looked around. The ocean hissed against the wreckage, as if trying to swallow the proof of what had happened. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket, the same one he'd carried since Tunisia, and wrote only one line. "We didn't land. We broke through." Later, a war correspondent who walked among the ruins that evening described the scene in his notes. "The Shermans came like a tide, and the tide never stopped." By nightfall, the beaches of Normandy were secure. Thousands of men dead, but thousands more alive because the tanks had made it through. In Berlin, the news arrived late. Hitler read the first reports of the landings in disbelief. He demanded details. How many tanks? Where did they come from? The answers came slowly, each one worse than the last. Shermans, hundreds of them, had crossed the channel. Machines that were never supposed to leave land had just rolled out of the sea. For the first time, no one in the Führer's bunker laughed. Goebbels noted in his diary that night, "The invasion has begun. The Americans are fighting with machines that swim." On the shores of Normandy, the engines kept running long after the shooting stopped. Mechanics worked through the night, patching holes, replacing treads. Grayson sat beside his tank, his hands still trembling, the taste of salt on his lips. He didn't feel like a hero, just a survivor. When the sun rose again, it caught the reflection of hundreds of steel hulls scattered across the sand, some upright, some buried in the surf. They gleamed in the pale light, a new kind of dawn. That morning, no one in the Wehrmacht spoke about American weakness anymore. The laughter that had begun in Berlin 3 years earlier had finally drowned, somewhere beneath the waves of Normandy. And from that sea of Shermans, history rolled ashore. By 1944, America had no night. The sky above Detroit glowed red from the furnaces, and the air itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of machines. The war might have been fought in Europe, but its heart, its pulse, beat in the factories of the United States. Everywhere, production had become a crusade. In Chicago, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, the hum of machinery was the sound of faith. Workers didn't talk about battles or front lines. They talked about quotas. Each bolt, each weld, each tank was a small victory. At the Ford plant, the walls shook day and night. Heat shimmered in the air as molten metal poured into molds, sparks flying like fireflies in the dark. Men stripped to undershirts, soaked in sweat, shouting over the roar of engines that would never rest. "If we can make one tank a day," one foreman yelled, "we can make 10. And they did. Eleanor Mason, once a car assembler, now a welder, worked 16-hour shifts at the Chrysler Arsenal. Her hands were blistered, her eyes burned from the glare, but she refused to stop. On her workbench, she kept a letter from her brother fighting under General Bradley near Cannes. He had written in pencil on smudged paper, "Your tanks sound like thunder when they come. Keep sending thunder." Eleanor read it every morning before her shift. Every time she welded another plate of armor, she imagined her brother behind it, safe. Across America, the numbers became unbelievable. 50,000 Shermans. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The country had turned itself into a living factory, a machine of machines. A government inspector visiting Detroit wrote in his report, "The city breathes steel and sweats gasoline." Entire neighborhoods revolved around the war effort. Children collected scrap metal, teenagers assembled shell casings, grandmothers rolled bandages in community halls. Even the radio announcers spoke like foremen. "Keep your hands working," one said during a nightly broadcast. "Every minute counts. Every rivet wins." The energy was relentless, but it came at a price. Accidents were daily. Burned hands, broken bones, exhaustion so deep it made people dream while standing. But no one complained. They believed that if they stopped, somewhere a soldier would die waiting for a machine that never came. One night in the River Rouge plant, an electrical surge shut down an entire assembly line. For 6 minutes, the factory went dark. Workers stood motionless, bathed in silence. Then a single light flickered back to life, and a mechanic shouted, "Let's get her breathing again." Within 10 minutes, the noise returned, deafening, defiant, unstoppable. In the offices of the War Production Board, economists calculated that the Allies were now outproducing the Axis 3-1. An admiral remarked, "We have found the greatest weapon of all, quantity with purpose." The industrial miracle had turned ordinary citizens into soldiers without uniforms. They didn't march. They worked. At midnight, radio bulletins from Europe crackled through the speakers. Shermans advancing beyond St. Lo. Allied armor crossing the Seine. The names meant little to those on the factory floor, but every headline carried a hidden echo. A tank born in their hands was now rolling across France. In Detroit's cafeteria, a poster hung above the tables. Every bolt a bullet, every tank a promise. Beneath it, someone had scrawled in pencil, "Promises keep men alive." By autumn, the production reached its peak. 50,000 Shermans, more than Germany could ever dream of matching. From the air, the assembly yards looked like rivers of iron. Long lines of tanks stretched to the horizon, their green armor gleaming under floodlights. A journalist touring the plant wrote, "It feels like standing inside the heartbeat of a giant." In one of the final reports from that year, a statistician described the scale simply. Every 10 minutes, a new Sherman rolls into the world. Every 10 minutes, the war shifts in our favor. But for the workers, the war wasn't measured in victories, only in days and nights. The machines kept moving, the furnaces kept burning, and the people kept going. When Eleanor received word that her brother had survived Normandy, she didn't cry. She just picked up her welding torch and whispered, "Then I'll build another." By December 1944, America had built an army of steel, not just tanks, but ships, planes, trucks, and guns. Together they formed a single symphony of purpose, conducted by millions who never saw the battlefield, yet shaped its outcome more than any general. And as the Shermans rolled across Europe, crushing snow and rubble under their treads, their sound carried far beyond the front lines. It was the rhythm of a nation that refused to stop, a living, burning heartbeat of iron and will. Detroit was no longer the Motor City. It was the arsenal of victory. And when its factories roared, the world listened. The Germans called it der Tiger. 80 tons of steel, a cannon that could tear through anything within a mile, and armor so thick that most Allied shells bounced off it like pebbles. It wasn't just a tank, it was a legend, a monster. By the winter of 1944, that legend was all Hitler had left to believe in. He called it the beast that will turn the tide. The Ardennes, December. The forests were silent, buried in snow, until the thunder of engines broke the stillness. It was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last, desperate gamble. The air was frozen, the ground solid as iron, and both sides knew this was where the war's fate would be sealed. Sergeant Tom Grayson, the same man who had driven a Sherman out of the sea at Normandy, was there too. Older, harder, his face lined with exhaustion. His tank stood hidden in a frozen ditch, engine humming low. "They say the Tigers are coming," his gunner whispered. Grayson looked at the horizon, gray and endless. "Then we'll see if they bleed." The first shots came at dawn. A single Tiger emerged from the mist, silent, massive, moving with the weight of inevitability. Its gun fired once. The shell hit a Sherman half a mile away and tore it apart in seconds. The crew never even saw what killed them. Grayson's hands shook on the controls. "Range?" he asked. 800 yards, came the reply. He knew their shells couldn't pierce the Tiger's front armor. But retreat wasn't an option. He shouted, "Flank left. Aim for the tracks." The Sherman roared forward, treads grinding against frozen mud. The Tiger turned, slow but unstoppable, its turret following them like an eye. The next shell screamed past, so close that it peeled paint from their hull. "Fire!" The Sherman's gun kicked back with a deafening crack. The shell hit the Tiger's side. Sparks, smoke, no damage. Again, another shot. The Tiger kept moving. Through the periscope, Grayson saw its gun swivel toward them. He held his breath. Then, from behind the Tiger, another Sherman appeared, smaller, faster, reckless. It fired point-blank into the rear. A blast, black smoke, flames. The monster stopped moving. For a moment, there was silence. Snowflakes drifted through the smoke, landing on metal still hot from battle. Grayson whispered, "We didn't beat it. We outlasted it." The Americans lost dozens of tanks that day, but they didn't stop. Every time a Sherman burned, another rolled forward. They didn't win through strength or technology. They won through persistence. For every Tiger that left a factory in Germany, 50 Shermans came from America. On the German side, despair began to spread. A radio operator in the Wehrmacht recorded a message from the front. "We destroy them, and they return. We burn their machines, and they rise again from the smoke." The myth of invincibility that had carried the Reich for years was collapsing under the weight of numbers. For the Sherman crews, it was never about heroism. It was survival, 1 hour, 1 mile, 1 shell at a time. Their tanks were crude, cramped, and terrifyingly flammable, but they kept moving. That winter, fuel froze, men froze, but the factories back home did not. Every tank lost was already being replaced in Detroit before the news even reached Europe. In late December, when the German advance finally stalled, the battlefield was littered with twisted hulks, Shermans and Tigers side by side, both blackened by fire. A war correspondent wrote from the Ardennes, "The difference between them is not what they're made of, but how many come back." Grayson's unit counted their dead that night. Out of 5 tanks, 2 still ran. He sat on the hull, wrapped in a blanket, his breath turning to mist. Someone asked him how they'd beaten the Tigers. He didn't look up when he answered, "We didn't. We just refused to stop losing." By January 1945, the Tiger's shadow had faded. Hitler's generals begged for more steel, more fuel, more miracles, But the factories were rubble, the supply lines broken. The Tiger had become a ghost, a symbol of what Germany once was. Meanwhile, the Shermans rolled east, through France, into Belgium, across rivers frozen solid. They crossed the Rhine in March, engines howling, treads grinding on German soil. The same sound that once echoed in Detroit now filled the valleys of the Reich. In Berlin, reports came in by the hour. Every division destroyed, every reserve gone. The staff in Hitler's bunkers stopped reading them aloud. One final dispatch from the front read: "The enemy is endless. Their tanks are fire and iron. They move without fear." And so the myth of the Tiger, the monster that was meant to save the Reich, died not in a blaze of glory, but in silence. Overwhelmed, outnumbered, outlasted. Back in his tank, Grayson looked across the white horizon and murmured, "All that armor, and still, it couldn't save them." In the distance, the faint hum of engines continued. The sound of America still building, still moving, still coming. The war wasn't over yet. But for Germany, the shadow of the Tiger had already burned away. April 1945, Berlin burned with a dry, hungry flame that ate stone as if it were paper. Streets that had carried parades now carried smoke. Stairwells breathed heat. The air tasted of plaster and cordite. The last orders in the bunker had lost their verbs. Above ground, buildings folded in on themselves with the tired sound of a city finally exhaling. Across the ocean, Detroit did not sleep. The night shift punched in under a red sky of furnace glow, faces chalked with grit, goggles leaving pale rings around tired eyes. The factory clocks kept their own war, quarter hours struck by hammers, shift whistles, the steadied breathing of engines that had not paused since 1942. On the wall of the River Rouge cafeteria, the poster still hung, every bolt a bullet. Someone had penciled beneath it, "Until the last door closes." In a welding bay, Eleanor Mason lifted her mask and wiped her forehead with the back of a gloved wrist. Her brother's last letter, creased, oil-stained, sat under a magnet by the time clock, across the Elbe soon. "Don't stop." She didn't. The arc flared, the line held. The work had become more than duty. It was habit. It was the way the heart remembered how to beat. The radio on the foreman's desk muttered through static. Allied armies on the Elbe, Soviets pressing from the east, bridges dropping behind retreating columns. And then the sentence that did not feel real when it arrived: "Hitler is dead." The announcement moved down the shop floor like a draft from a door suddenly opened. No cheering, just the first clean silence in 4 years. Men set wrenches down and looked at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. Someone killed the power to a row of drills. The lights throbbed once and steadied. In that brief hush, the plant revealed itself. The smell of hot steel and cutting fluid, the sweet metal tang that had lived in every stitch of clothing and every lunch pail since Pearl Harbor. All the hours were in the air. "Do we stop?" a new hire asked, voice too loud in the quiet. "Not yet," the foreman said. "Trains still run east." So they kept going. Outside, boxcars waited in a line that looked like a sentence without a period. Inside, inspectors chalked initials on armor plate with the same careful motion used to sign a name. The pace had become a country's posture. Even victory would have to catch it from behind. Sergeant Tom Grayson, somewhere west of the Elbe, wrote by flashlight on the back of a ration box. "Berlin tastes like smoke from 100 miles away," he scribbled. "Engines howling all night. Roads full of people going nowhere." He had slept on his tank's deck the previous evening, the metal warm from the day's run. They crossed villages that were mostly roofs and cellars. They passed columns of prisoners who stared straight ahead, faces like blank pages. When the BBC announced the death in Berlin, his gunner simply said, "Good." Then, after a while, "What now?" In Detroit, the answer was the same as it had been yesterday: work. A production planner traced a graph with a dull pencil and realized the line had no place to go but down. He didn't show it to anyone. It felt indecent, like telling a man his heartbeat was a surplus. By mid-April, convoys of Shermans rolled from depots to ports and found not battle but bottleneck. Europe was filling with tanks faster than war could empty it. On a siding near the Rouge plant, a switchman counted hulls by the hundred and ran out of numbers he trusted. "We started building to catch up," he said to no one. "Now we build because we don't know how to stop." A War Production Board memo arrived on a Saturday, Reduce output by stages pending theater requirements. The foreman read it twice, folded it, put it in his pocket, and let the line run. Habit beat paper. Out on the floor, Eleanor paused at shift's end and listened to the factory breathe. She could hear the small sounds again. The tap of a dropped washer, the scrape of a stool, the cough of a compressor winding down. For years, those noises had been swallowed by the roar. Now they emerged like birds after a storm. "We'll be told when," a friend said beside her, eyes on the window's red glow. "Till then, we keep the lights hot." Across the Elbe, Grayson's unit stopped beside a half-broken bridge and waited for orders that kept changing tense. A Russian patrol waved from the far bank. Someone tossed a pack of cigarettes across the gap, an awkward offering that landed in the mud and was still accepted. The war had begun to move like an old machine, still powerful, but grinding toward a halt you could hear if you were willing to listen. The day the city fell, Berlin sounded like 1,000 doors closing. News reached the Rouge at noon. The foreman finally pulled the master switch for Bay 3. The belt slowed, then eased to a stop. People did not clap. They stood with hands at their sides, the quiet pressing in, heavier than the heat had ever been. In that stillness the smell remained. Oil, steel, sweat, and with it the memory of what those smells had bought. America had not won a single decisive hour. It had won the hours themselves, stacked in boxes, shipped by rail, bolted into shape. Endurance had been the weapon. Endurance had fired every shot. Toward evening, the lights came back up for cleaning crews. A broom whispered along concrete, where shavings lay like a glittering frost. Eleanor took her letter down from the magnet and folded it carefully, then wrote one line on its back before slipping it into her pocket. "If you made it, it's because we didn't stop." She didn't know if the mail would catch him before the next march east, or if there would even be a next march. On the Atlantic docks, ships unloaded armor into fields already crowded. Logistics officers walked the rows and shook their heads. A captain wrote in his log, "Supply has outlived demand." He didn't know what to do with a sentence like that in a world built on need. Night fell over Detroit without the usual thunder. Houses along Miller Road opened their windows to a quieter sky. In living rooms, people turned the radio down and could suddenly hear their refrigerators, their own breathing, the neighborhood dog complaining at nothing. The silence felt like a stranger at the door. Back in Europe, Grayson climbed from his tank and watched an orange glow on the horizon that should have meant sunrise and didn't. He felt for the first time that the machine beneath him might be allowed to rest, and that he might not know how. In the morning, the Rouge whistle sounded anyway. Old habits keep their appointments. Some men came in and swept. Some mopped oil that would never stain another tread. Someone polished a torque wrench until it gleamed like a metal and then put it back where it lived. They had built to catch up. Then they built because they had learned to breathe that way. Now, with the war ending, the breath hung in the air, looking for a purpose. On a field outside Le Havre, a freight train braked and exhaled. Flat cars stood in rows beneath a pale sun. Beyond the tracks stretched a plain of green armor. Thousands of hulks parked nose to tail, their guns pointed at nothing, their engines cooling into the same silence that had settled over Detroit. The night shift would soon end. The furnaces would go dark by order, not by fatigue. And the men who had made rivers of steel would look up and see that the river had nowhere left to run. In that quiet, the next question arrived, heavy as a hull. What do you do with an army when the war no longer wants it? Beyond the depot fence, the rows of Shermans waited under thin rain, as if listening for an answer that was coming by rail. Summer, 1945. The war was over, but the fields of Europe were still full of steel. Near Le Havre, in northern France, the wind moved through rows of Sherman tanks, thousands of them, standing silent under a pale sun. They stretched for miles, turret to turret, green paint fading to dust. Birds nested inside open hatches. The smell of oil still hung in the air, sharp and ghostly. Captain Ray Morgan walked between the lines, clipboard in hand. Every few steps he stopped, wrote a number, shook his head. 3,000 here, he said to his driver. Maybe more over the hill. The driver kicked a pebble that clinked off a track. We built for victory, Morgan murmured. Now we're building for forgetting. He wasn't exaggerating. The war had ended faster than production could stop. Factories back home were still finishing contracts, still pouring metal, still shipping crates labeled ordnance. urgent. By the time the ships reached Europe, the enemy no longer existed. Now all that power sat here, rusting in peace. One report from the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps called the scene the pile of giants. It was meant as a technical description, but to the men who saw it, it felt like a graveyard. Some of the Shermans were earmarked for allies, the French, the Dutch, the newly forming armies of the post-war world. Others would be melted down, turned back into the raw materials of consumer life: refrigerators, car frames, washing machines. The same factories that had forged them for war were already preparing catalogs for peacetime. Morgan walked past one tank whose side was scorched black. He ran his hand over the metal, felt the faint ridges of bullet marks, the roughness of flame. "You made it," he whispered, "but no one needs you now." Veterans came to see them, too, soldiers waiting for ships home, drawn to the strange quiet of the field. One leaned on his crutch beside a tank and said, "I thought they were immortal." He paused. Turns out they were just temporary heroes. A few men opened the hatches and climbed inside. The interiors smelled of dust and old smoke. Someone had scratched a name on the inside wall, Eleanor, followed by a small heart. No one knew who had written it. Maybe a mechanic, maybe a soldier. But it stayed there, a reminder of all the hands that had touched these machines. Sergeant Tom Grayson stood beside one of the tanks he recognized. The serial number matched the one he had driven through the Ardennes. It was dinted, patched, still carrying a faint burn mark on the right tread. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, a letter he had written weeks before but never sent. It was addressed to Eleanor Mason, the factory worker from Detroit whose name he had once read in a shipping note welded to the inside of his hull. He read it quietly to himself. "Your hands built what saved mine. Now they stand in rows, waiting for the end like soldiers without orders. I don't know if this is peace. Maybe it's just the silence after too much noise. But when I see them, I think of you, and I think mercy has a sound. It's the sound of an engine that doesn't have to start again." He folded the letter back and slid it into the tank's periscope slot. "You can keep it," he said softly. Then he turned and walked away. By August, the fields grew over with weeds. Children from nearby villages played among the hulks, sliding down the armor, pretending to fight wars their parents never wanted to speak about again. An army photographer captured one final image, the sun setting over hundreds of tanks, their shadows long and straight, pointing east, toward the continent they had helped to free. In the official post-war report, a single line summarized it all: material surplus to requirement, to be scrapped or stored pending future use. Future use. The phrase lingered, almost hopeful, as if the world might one day need these machines again, though no one truly wished for that. For Captain Morgan, the sight of all that silent steel was unbearable. He wrote in his journal that night, "Every bolt, every plate, every gallon of fuel, all of it carried belief. And belief, once spent, leaves behind its shell." Back in the United States, the factories were already changing signs, turning from arsenals to assembly lines. Workers clocked in to make cars again, but the rhythm felt different. Too quiet. Somewhere, in a scrapyard on the outskirts of Le Havre, the first torch hissed to life. Sparks flew, bright as fireworks. Metal that had once shaped the fate of nations began to fall apart, one glowing piece at a time. And as the cutting went on through the night, a strange truth hung over the field, that even victory, when it comes in steel, is too heavy to carry forever. Years later, the war existed only in photographs and museum glass. The world had changed its noise. Detroit's factories made cars again, their floors polished, their ceilings painted white. The smoke was gone, replaced by the hum of peacetime industry. But under the new paint, the ghosts of weld lines still ran, invisible scars of a time when every spark meant survival. At Fort Knox, a museum guide turned a corner light on. Dust hung in the beam like snow. There it stood, an M4 Sherman, olive paint dulled to bronze, the edges rounded by time. Its tracks were clean now, its turret frozen in one last pose. Children crowded around it, whispering. One boy looked up at his father and asked, "Dad, is this the tank that won the war?" The man smiled. "No, son," he said quietly. "The war was won by the people who built it." Near the display sat a small glass case. Inside lay a rusted wrench and a faded photograph of a woman in overalls. Eleanor Mason, Detroit, 1943. Next to it, a yellowed newspaper clipping read, Arsenal of Democracy, 49,234 Sherman tanks produced. Visitors passed by, some barely glancing, others stopping for a moment longer than they expected. Veterans leaned closer, reading the notes aloud in low voices. One man rested his hand against the cool armor and murmured, "Still feels alive." There was no pride in his tone, only gratitude. For those who remembered, the tank was never just metal. It was motion, sweat, and noise, the rhythm of hands turning bolts in the dark, of men who refused to give up when the world seemed ready to. It wasn't the perfect machine. It broke, burned, and was rebuilt. Yet it kept coming, as if powered by the will of the millions behind it. History would later argue over numbers and strategies, over which battles mattered most. But the truth was simpler. The Sherman wasn't the strongest, the fastest, or the most feared. It was enough, because there were enough. Each one a heartbeat in the long rhythm of a nation that refused to stand still. In a quiet corner of the museum, another plaque carried the words of President Roosevelt's old broadcast. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy, for it is not the machines themselves that will win, but the spirit that builds them." Outside, the afternoon sun hit the tank's surface, and for a moment it glowed, as if remembering what it was made for. In Germany, long after the war, fields grew over the craters, and the forests swallowed the wrecks left behind. Children stumbled upon bits of metal, pieces of history turned to rust. Somewhere, a farmer's plow struck a buried plate, and he wiped the dirt away to reveal faint stenciled letters. U.S.A. He set it aside carefully, as if it still carried heat. In Detroit, the Rouge River flowed past the old plant, slower now, quieter. The buildings stood mostly empty, but if you listened, you could almost hear the faint echo of the furnaces, the clang of steel on steel. It was not a haunting, exactly, more a memory that refused to fade. The boy in the museum pressed his hand against the glass, eyes wide. "It's so small," he said. His father nodded. "Big things don't always look big when they're right in front of you." They moved on, and the hall fell silent again. The Sherman stayed, still and patient, a monument not to destruction, but to endurance. A reminder that the war had been won not by genius or glory, but by millions of ordinary hands that refused to stop turning. Hitler once laughed at America. America answered with 50,000 reasons to never laugh again. And when history was done counting, only one truth remained. The war was not won by hate or power. It was won by those who never stopped building.